Okay, so welcome everybody. Nice to see some of the familiar faces and names on the screen, so welcome. Today we have a special seminar as part of our fellowship seminar series. I'm happy and honored to introduce you to Professor Abebe Zegeye. Abebe is a senior research fellow with ISGAP and also is a coordinator for our publications program. Abebe has a PhD from Oxford University and has taught at universities throughout the world, including Yale, UC Santa Barbara, the University of Warwick, the University of South Africa, and others. And since 2014, he has been associated with a variety of educational institutions in Ethiopia and worked with the Federal Ministry of Science and Higher Education in Ethiopia. Abebe has published many articles and books, including an important book entitled Beta Israel, one of the cultural and religious minorities as well as religious minorities in Lake Tana area of Ethiopia. Today, Abebe is speaking on, the title of his talk is Apartheid and Antisemitism. So Abebe, thank you for being here, and the floor is yours. And Abebe will speak for roughly 20 to 30 minutes, and then we can have Q&A. So Abebe.
Great, thank you so much, Charles. I don't know how to relate it. It's just, this is an interest I had. I had the privilege of holding a position at the University of South Africa of Prime Media Chair of Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And that experience, 3-year experience, working on principally not on Holocaust, but on genocide in Africa. I worked on Rwanda and a bit on Namibia and developed some ideas about this, but I've been always intrigued. Therefore, since I've been associated with ISGAP, I begin to kind of go back to it. I put an image there, an image of the first synagogue in Pretoria. I would like to talk about that synagogue as a way of telling a story of what happened to that synagogue and why it was important. It's trying to deal with issues of coexistence, issues of living side by side. I'll come back to that toward the end. This synagogue you see there on the picture was opened in 17th of August, 1898. As you see it, it's a very Byzantine structure, and it's an important memory for Jewish community, which played a very significant role both in the South African history, in particular on the struggle against apartheid. And I'll try to link why. And I think this relates to the notion of justice in Jewish culture. And one sees it in different mode, but I'm more interested in looking at South Africa. And I had the privilege of working with a lot of the people who are members of the NC, members of the Communist Party, members of the Black Consciousness Group. And I wonder, and that's what I'm interested, I wonder what they would say now, what's happening in South Africa. I mean, that's what my notion is. It was created by a very important community that period, and we look at it when they created this, when they built this synagogue, there was something like 700 members of congregation as a place of worship in Pretoria area. Then it used to be called Transvaal. It was a separate republic. But what happened was what happened in Kimberley in 1867 and later on in Johannesburg area in 1886. In Kimberley, we have the discovery of diamond. In Johannesburg, we have the discovery of gold. That changed the nature of relationship, both what happened to the Transvaal Republic, and then also what happens to the community and what happened in the creation of apartheid later on. I mean, there always been, there was the Anglo-Boer War, and we tend, and later on, there is a new arrangement where whites come together to form one government by excluding majority of the people, majority of South Africans. It's interesting to look at that period because in the Transvaal Assembly, there were a number of people who were both highly successful business Jewish people and also member of the assembly. Kruger, who was an important figure in South African history, was also a very serious Afrikaner religious person. Therefore, he had a very interesting relationship to the Jewish population there. In other words, he actually allowed this to be built. It's quite a beautiful building. But just jumping in, 1948, when it's interesting, 1948, the creation of Israel, 1948, the winning of the apartheid government, which began to implement harsh race relationship. That doesn't mean there was no race problem before that. It was actually a very racial society from the beginning. The Black population started opposing that by creating a number of organizations. Also, the Jewish community participated in that. There were 3 important organizations: the African National Congress, the Indian Congress, and then the South African Communist Party, which has a large number of Jewish membership. Then what happens is, I'm just moving so that I will try to say why this building is important. In 95, then what happens was the 3 organizations and others got together, started a movement which allows them to oppose the new apartheid regime, and the apartheid regime pulled together something like 156 people of the leadership of the 3, and they started the treason trial. It happened, the treason trial took a long time, from August 1958 to March 1961. Interestingly, this synagogue was taken over by the states and made it, the old synagogue became a court. They gave all kinds of reasons, but it was very interesting in this, it became basically a special Supreme Court to trial. And if one looks all those people, I think at the end it was something like 30 people were tried. Quite a large number of them members of the NC, the Indian Congress and South African Communist Party. It was quite interesting how some of the Communist Party members, despite being communist, when they arrived for trial at this building, one person by the name Rusty Bernstein, he was struck how he's been, he find himself being judged in a place of worship. I mean, that's one of very symbolic important. That's one section. Then later on, in 1977, 7th of September 1977, there was the inquest of the days of Steve Biko. In police custody, he was brutally murdered. Interestingly, the person who represented the Biko family was Sidney Kentridge, again a member of the Jewish community, which they found is very interesting. So what I'm trying to say is, here is a building initially started as to serve something like 700 to 1,000 members of Jewish community in Pretoria, then Transvaal. and later on becomes a special Supreme Court to trial people. I mean, that's very important to look at it in that way. So I'm not trying to return to the past. I think we can take the picture now. I'm not trying to return to the past so that we can recreate it, but I think understanding the past is critical and important. It's, as Cabral would say, is we cannot go back to the old sources, but I think we can go near it, as I said, or can get close to it. I mean, what was it that there was this combination of three movements, ANC, Indian Congress, and several South African Communist Party, which played a very important role in changing the nature, in helping to change the nature of South African South Africa to make it a better society. Again, one has to be very careful that this is only that, but there was anti-Semitism running through the white community throughout that period. The Afrikaners not only were anti-Semitic, but also later on, as we find out, they became very close to Germany, not to Germany, to the Nazi Germany, and accepted most of the ideology of that. But they found themselves in a very contradictory position, because after First World War, Namibia was given Namibia was given to them by League of Nations to become, in practical terms, become part of South Africa. For that one, and because there was a demand by the German group of return of their colonies of Tanganyika and some the three areas within Africa. Therefore, they were not sure how to deal with that, but also they were also under the British rule. Therefore, they had to be sure that they need to distance themselves. The way so the British resolved that is they brought in the South African army as part of the war effort. It's actually very important to say that it was only South Africa which played a very important role. Why am we talking about South Africa? Again, at the beginning, I mentioned 1867 and 1886. This is what kind of the foundation of British colonial policy, especially vis-a-vis important sources. Gold became gold standard, etc. Therefore, most of us tend to think about it in terms of what happened, but the British concern was to make sure the Germans don't get to hold on the mining area of both of Kimberley and Johannesburg area. So the British, basically one of the things they did was they made a compromise with the Afrikaners to have a political rule. And but that's what basically is after the Anglo-Boer War. That was basically the deal, that you can run the country, but we will control the economy. Not the economy broadly, but in particular gold. There was, were there anti-Semitism that period? In many ways, harsh one as such among the British, among the English-speaking population, as well as the Afrikaner population. What happened later on, as they control the thing, and as they begin to see the changes, they begin to not too much to worry about it. They want to control. There were other issues. Therefore, anti-Semitism, even though it was there, it was what one would call it a classical sense of anti-Semitism, was put aside. How about the anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in the other part of the larger population? As I said, that's another story. And I think that's what I would like to get into that. Here one has to be very careful to differentiate anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I think what happened after Second World War, the new arrangement, the Pretoria was seen as part of the Western world, and through NATO, through other things, Africans, the opposition groups, including the Communist Party, saw them allying themselves with Soviet Union and fighting for independence. Therefore, I think one has to be very careful how we deal with anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in South Africa. Unfortunately or fortunately, it depends. From my perspective, there was later on, when we come into the 1970s, there was what is called the Pretoria-Jerusalem axis, where there was, one person put it, the unspoken alliance between Pretoria and Jerusalem, that they found themselves, even though there are different, even though there is, I would say, anti-Zionism, it was politically expedient for the South African government to ally itself with Israel because of its past, its situation in terms of international politics. So for the present period, after the 1970s and after the 1994 election, there is this incredible shift of how majority of the population reacted to this. But I must say, there are two important essays written by, which was published by ISGAP in his two books. And for people who are, I think they could go to the website. I think both papers are available by Milton Shen. One is in the Yale papers, Anti-Semitism Comparative Perspective. Another one, a Global Anti-Semitism Crisis of Modernity. I think if you want to know more detail about, to understand the post 94, especially South Africa, I think you need to understand it, you ought to read it. But what's happening now is, here we have, I mentioned the idea of three important organizations working for justice. And now in Parliament at the moment, there is, in South African Parliament, an attempt to introduce basically some kind of, it's part of the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanction Group, the implementation and the protection of Palestinian Solidarity Right Bill. It's done by a lawyer by the name Patel, interestingly, ironically supported by a member of parliament, by Mandla Mandela, who's a grandson of Nelson Mandela. How do we understand this? I mean, why we came to this? Also, most of you have seen the Human Rights Watch report the other day. I think I don't have to go through those debates because most of you are aware of it, saying, basically a critique of Israel toward the way Israel state deal with Palestinians. I would like to move to my own experience now and begin to think, where should we go? How should we undo these things? I'll give you one example. When I took up the job of Prime Media Chair of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, there was enough lobby to introduce to South African classrooms, especially high schools, study of Holocaust. And I also tried to introduce the study of genocide. So I went to the Ministry of Education in South Africa, and the two important ministers happened to be in South African classification, Indian Muslims, I was basically attacked for, basically saying, look, we should not, there was enough pressure from the South African Jewish board and others to introduce it, but if they have their way, they would not have that on the curriculum. My interest was actually genocide is an important issue now. It happened not only in Namibia, but it just happened again coincidentally in Rwanda in 1994, the year South Africa became independent, if you want to see it that way. That we need to tell the population, and there is a lot to learn from both the Holocaust and the genocide. And that was actually ruled out. It was interestingly, they were allowing, it was easy to introduce Holocaust studies, but not genocide studies, because they saw me basically as representing the state, the interest of Prime Media, which was a Jewish Prime Media chair, the company which is owned by a Jewish company. They saw it as a way of they saw it in the present context, and they didn't want that. So what I like to see is there is a lot of debate. There was a lot of issues being raised, but it has become actually quite one-sided now. So maybe the debate should be, especially among Black intellectuals and others, is the issue of coexistence. That is, we just don't tolerate each other, but we need to live side by side, to think and to work and to live side by side. Unless we do that, my worry at this moment, and at least in the context of South Africa, at least within the elite, the political elite, the debate has gone to one spectrum. It's not the Palestinian issue became the only issue people are interested in understanding, even though there is a very vibrant Jewish community which has been part of the South African history and played very important role in transforming that society. So maybe I'll leave it there, and it's 25 minutes now. I'll leave it there and see what people think. This is a bigger project I'm dealing with, trying to understand the history of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and the issue of coexistence. Are we really doing anything enough? We're doing enough to make any kind of headway, or are we stuck in different compartments, and we're not talking to each other? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Abebe. So thank you. So we have a half an hour more or less for Q&A and conversation. So if anybody has a comment or a question, please feel free. We're a small group, so feel free to ask a question. Does anybody have a question or a comment? Okay, so I'll ask. I don't want to just hog the floor as the host, but does anybody have a question? Okay, I'll start off. I actually have a lot of questions, but I'll be brief. Baby, you mentioned you studied genocide in Namibia, and I know that there's been studies showing the connection between what happened in Namibia to the Holocaust. A lot of young German soldiers and later SS officers practiced in Namibia and then went back to Europe to carry out the Holocaust. Can you comment on that connection?
So shall I deal with that as now, or?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Then we can take other comments or questions.
I mean, there is a book called the Kaiser Holocaust, German Forgotten Genocide. I think what happened, most of the young officers who were present in Namibia, Southwest Africa, who carried the genocide among the Namibian people, were transferred and became very important players of the Nazi Germany. And there are many, there's this book called by David, it's two people who wrote this book. Therefore, yes, there is direct link if you want. And also, that was also true in terms of the sympathy among the Afrikaner, as I mentioned, within South Africa. And when you look at it, when you look at all the kind of transfer of, experimenting on people, how long people would survive if you deprive them water, all those kind of issues, all the kind of experiment which you later on see in Europe was done. But I mean, that's not only true for Namibia, but if you want to understand what the Dutch did in Far East, what the British did in Ireland, they tend to be replicated again in the colonies and then brought back home, back to Europe.
Okay, thanks. Does anybody else have a question or a comment? It's a quiet crowd. I'll ask another question then. So, Abebe, and this is maybe in the contemporary context. So you mentioned, and I don't want to, I can't quote you exactly, but we said we should be careful about the connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And as you know, many scholars at ISGAP show that there is a connection between demonizing Israel or anti-Zionism and contemporary anti-Semitism. And I did a study with Ed Kaplan in Europe. We interviewed 10,000 people in 10 European countries, and we studied classical forms of anti-Semitism and questions what we called Israel bashing. And what we found was that levels of Israel bashing and anti-Semitism were actually lower than we expected, but the connection between anti-Semitism, classical forms of anti-Semitism and bashing Israel were very high. And we found, for example, that people who bashed Israel were 13 times more likely than the average population to also be classically anti-Semitic. And we know the apartheid canard, if Israel is an apartheid state, as Mr. Roth argued for in his recent report last week from Human Rights Watch, that Israel is an apartheid state. From a liberal human rights perspective, if Israel is an apartheid state, from a liberal perspective, it should be dismantled as the apartheid entity, as we all struggled in the before 1994 to end the apartheid regime. So the IRA definition, a lot of scholarship show the connection, and South Africa, there's elements of the South African population that are very anti-Israel, and as you mentioned, it even crosses over into other forms of anti-Semitism, where Holocaust education becomes problematic because it's probably part of the Zionist agenda. And the Jewish community in South Africa, from what I know, through studies and through speaking with people, there's an out-migration of the Jewish community in South Africa, and those remaining feel a lot of pressure in the society of contemporary forms of anti-Semitism with an S. So can you speak to kind of what's going on in the contemporary context while Israel is being demonized? How does that affect levels of anti-Semitism for South African Jews?
Okay, I think it's important to talk about South Africa and which population. When I said, I think your classification about the South African elite, most likely you're right. But that's a very small section of it. And also among the the Muslim community who associate itself, which is a new thing, a new understanding. But I think if you look at the African population, that's what I say we need to be very careful. If you go to some of the Christian communities, most of them have a very positive attitude toward Israel. At least that's my observation. Okay. Therefore, that's what I'm saying earlier on. Do we deal with that elite group? I mean, there was an infamous kind of not on my watch thing. I don't know whether you remember it. You know, there was a lot of and they tried to get, to legitimize it. They would like to get as many people to sign. It didn't get far, but that's among the chattering class, etc. Therefore, what I'm trying to push is and what we learned from what happened earlier on with the treason trial, etc. What is there we learn to bring to now? It's not really that whether there's correlation or not. If you see what happens is the anti-Semitism of the English and the anti-Semitism of the Afrikaners, as they become very successful, they basically don't care about it. At least they don't see it as a threat. If you look at the history of them, actually, from say 1948 on, once the Afrikaners become, if Germany had won, it would have been a different issue. Once they control the state, they were not really much interested about that. Actually, they allied themselves with Israel because it fits them vis-a-vis Cold War politics. Okay, so my interest is that, do we get caught up in that, or do we approach? I think that's one of the things we're trying to do is, if we have a better understanding of what happened of the past of South African history, and a much more thing done about classroom, we might be able to change the discourse. Therefore, it's not that I'm avoiding whether there is a correlation. It depends which population you're talking to. For the elite, the two are very much correlated. But for majority of South Africans, I would say most of especially the majority of the population, I don't think so. They don't even know what the notion of anti-Semitism is. And when you talk about the Muslim population, we're talking about 2% of South African population. Well, I think we need to be, therefore, it will be interesting what the people in Cape Town are doing in the Holocaust Center there, and what people are doing are they really talking to the larger population, or is it these things which is going on among the elite? That's what I'm trying to understand.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else with a comment or question?
I do have a question, actually.
Cool.
I've seen a lot of my friends are from South Africa, and they say that the older generation doesn't share a lot of the anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic feeling that the newer generation on campus does. Do you have any insight as to why? Like, do you think it's increasing? Do you have any insight on why it would be?
I think there is a huge movement in campuses to divest from Israel. It's a huge movement. It's that transition I saw. What happened after '94? It's a small group of people who are very, it's a very vocal group, which I saw it in even the high school where my kids were going. People who are participating in Amnesty International, etc., were becoming, were becoming anti-Israel. Whether they are well informed or not, that's another issue. For it, the older generation of Afrikaans and English-speaking people, once they become successful, they are in control. They completely ignore this. They don't see it as a problem now. That doesn't mean they are free of anti-Semitism, but it's not an issue. But for the new generation, it's another issue. I think that's what we need to face. I don't think so anyone is facing. I mean, if you look at all the publication, etc., it becomes campus politics and controlled by something like 2% of that population. That's why you see that, and most people who don't want to be I think there's a lot of work to be done. That's what I'm trying to do.
Okay, thanks, Abebe. Thank you, Daphne. So Marlene typed in a question. Marlene, would you like to ask the question on camera? Feel free. It's a good question.
Let me unmute you. 1 second. All right.
So the question I had, as somebody who organizes Holocaust and Genocide Week in Canada, is you mentioned that you had approached the ministry about setting up some sort of Holocaust education, and it didn't go over well. So I was just wondering, is there any kind of organized movement at this point to teach about the Holocaust in elementary, high schools, or universities at all?
I cannot say much because I've left South Africa for a while, but there was approval at one time to teach Holocaust at high school level. And there is a lot of activity, at least at 3 universities, at center, in Johannesburg, at UNISA, and at University of Cape Town. There've been an attempt. How much successful, I'm not sure. I cannot, I've been away from South Africa. Mine was late, in the early 2000, that period.
Thank you.
Thanks. I see our colleague Erwin Kotler's on the line, and Andrew Orkin, 2 human rights activists from Canada involved in the South African context and also in the struggle against anti-Semitism. Would either of you like to ask a question? I can't see you, but I just see your names. If you're welcome to chime in. Okay. Okay. Would anybody else like to ask a question? Mr. and Mrs. Adler, you're welcome to. Michael.
Low crowd today.
Yeah, it's a quiet group. If anybody would like to type a question, if you don't want to ask online, you're welcome to as well. Okay, so I'm going to ask another question, Abebe. And if anybody wants to ask a question, please feel free. So Abebe, you mentioned the African population, I guess the so-called Black African population or the indigenous population. I know in some sectors of the population there is an affinity to Israel, and some even see the Zionist project as something.
There is a Zionist church, actually.
Yeah, and there's some Jewish indigenous groups too, but is in that sector of the population or the demographics. And a colleague, Ansel Brown, does work on sort of notions of Pan-Africanism and Black consciousness and the connections to Zionism as kind of as a model to assert indigenous rights in a colonial entity. Have you come across any of that? Is that part of the public discourse or the African discourse to any extent, to a large extent at this moment that you're aware of?
No, I'm not aware of anything. I mean, there is affiliation and sympathy, and also some of them call themselves the Zionist Church. They meet once a year, I think Christmas time. And what I was trying to say is these debates, what we talked about, doesn't exist in the, they're not aware of it even. That's why I say it's among a small group of people. So what I'm trying is, it has become basically now a debate between local Jewish group and Muslim groups. And it's bizarre. To me, it's the history is so different than that. How comes we end up being that instead of broader issues? Therefore, there is some failure there. I'm not sure. I'm not to blame anyone, but what I see is there is a need for a debate and a discussion around that issue, because we are spending huge amount of time, energy. I don't know whether this bill, which is being brought out by Patel, whether it would pass, and most likely it's more of symbolic one. But you know, how did we end up there, and how comes the issue is not done, or is it left? It's left for this group to fight it over. But among the African population, the notion of Israel, the notion of this are basically biblically informed. The way I see it.
Okay. Daphne, Andrew is trying to ask a question, I believe, but he's having technological issues. Could you unmute him and see if he can ask the question?
Yep. Andrew, I just asked you to unmute. I don't know if he can hear us. It might be an internet problem, so we might be cutting off.
Okay.
But
So Andrew, you have the capacity to unmute yourself if you want to ask the question.
yeah, yeah, he should be able to.
Okay. All right. Would anybody else like to ask a question in the meanwhile?
I'm not too familiar with the topic, but considering you're from Ethiopia, I would like to know if you have any insight into how are the Jews perceived there nowadays? I know they're being rescued, and I know the situation is hard, but in your lifetime, do you see a steady change in the way Jews are perceived because of Israel?
It's not because of Israel. I mean, they are perceived differently now because they're successful. I don't want to be economically determinist, but they are much, much welcome now than they were when I grew up. Give you a good example. My father was visiting, one of the things for most Ethiopian Christians were visiting Jerusalem, and he bumped to somebody at a hotel. They looked at each other and said, they were surprised because they know each other extremely well. They work in the same department in the Ministry of Health, etc. And they say, are you a Jew? They were asking who's a Jew in a way. For people kept their identity very low for that period. Ethiopian Jews there were schools, especially not only in Gondar, but in Asmara and other places, were highly educated and were members. I mean, there are people who are now claiming to be Jews, even people who are in Canada are big Ethiopians who are claiming to be Jews. Therefore, I think that is changing. That's changing because now we have something like 150,000 Ethiopian Jews in Israel, and there are, I think, 2,000 or so came over recently. For the attitude has changed, and Ethiopian relationship with Israel has been, it's in many ways is very positive, but because of the pressure they get in, what we call the real politics, from Haile Selassie periods, from the creation of Israel from 1948 to our present, there's been always a close relationship politically. But the Ethiopian dynamic is changing because of the presence of Ethiopians in Israel. And also the Ethiopians in Israel are beginning to go back in a different mode. Most of them, there's a lot of going back and forwards now. And I think that's just creating a positive vibe.
Thank you. Yeah, I had no idea.
Andrew, are you able to ask a question now? I saw that you're more connected somehow.
I think there is something from Marlene.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, the old one. I just saw I'm looking at the chat.
There's a new question from Marlene. Marlene, do you want to ask it or should I read it? Daphne, can you unmute Marlene?
I can read it.
Okay. All the panelists should be able to unmute themselves as they like. So
cool.
It's a party.
Marlene, go ahead. Thanks. I can't unmute.
The question is whether is the Jewish community in general experiencing greater level of anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
I think there is a large number of whites are leaving for all kinds of reasons. Australia to Canada to, since 94. I'm not sure they're leaving because of anti-Semitism as such. I still have that relationship and people are coming and going. But I think there is, because of crime, because of all kinds of issues, people are leaving South Africa. And a large number of, Canada is full of people who left. Again, I would like to correct something I said in the sense of the Afrikaners, when they become successful, they withdraw. But that's not necessarily true. During the apartheid period, a large number of Jews who were in the army found it very difficult to be there. Some of them left for that reason. But at present, I would imagine, there is this huge issue, and I'm not sure whether people are leaving because of anti-Semitism at this moment.
Okay. Okay, thank you. And Andrew, are you with us? No, he's having issues.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Abebe, would you like to make some final comments? Or?
We'll see where I'll be in about 6 months' time with this thing, because I'm very curious of what happened in the treason trial and what happened, because I know most of the people who are still alive. I'm hoping to interview them and see what they're saying and how they perceive the changes. And if anything has to be done, is to me is, if one can deal with other issues, what I call coexistent issue, living side by side, I think that's going to be an important issue. I think it's been hijacked. The whole issue has been hijacked by one political group, and that is winning. I was in Durban when that big debate came up, and how that, and things have changed since then. But what I'm trying to say is, we need. For me, maybe in 6 months' time, see what I have to say. I would do more work.
You're focusing on coexistence among the people who went through the trial, focusing on...
No, about the present. I want to see if those people can come together and create that kind of movement. What's happening now? Why things are going wrong? Therefore, I want to interview people, both who survived and also I know enough people in South Africa to understand what the move is at the present in South Africa. Therefore, I'm more interested about the present, but to look back in terms of how they managed to work together, and now why there is a problem now.
So focusing on anti-Semitism or on
anti-Semitism, on what happened, why there is this, why people are, one of the issues anti-Semitism in the sense of with that disappear, following Marlene's question, if majority of the Jewish population leaves to Europe or to Israel, would that stop? No, it won't stop. As we have learned it in Eastern Europe, there is anti-Semitism without presence of Jews. Therefore, I think we need to think through these issues. What is it that the nature of politics is changing, and I think we need to deal with it and leaving it. It's some of the debate about the definition of anti-Semitism now we've been debated, and how it's going to be at we at this moment is, I don't know how to explain to you what it means for a chair, for me to be a chair of Holocaust studies, and also to spend time in Israel. Then the kind of pressure one is at is huge. There was, people who like to boycott, to do this and that. That's how far it was then. I would imagine the same now. So we leave it as is now, or how do we deal with it? Therefore, I don't have an answer. I'm just saying it's a major issue.
Also, there's a lot of intolerance for migrants, African migrants. There's a lot of issues.
That is another issue, which is basically the whole the failure of the the NC government is leading to all kinds of issues. Therefore, this is, I think, one has to deal with that and a number of issues. And the Israeli-Palestinian issue doesn't become a smoke screen.
Okay, I think Daphne, Andrew's trying still to unmute, but he can't. Is there anything you can do?
I just asked him to unmute. It should pop up on his screen. Yeah.
All right. So I think we're going to leave it there. So maybe on behalf of Daphne and I and the ISGAP team, thank you for your presentation today. It's an important issue. Thank you for taking the time. We appreciate it. And Daphne, could you let everybody know when the next Fellows seminar is?
We have our next fellow webinar on June 2nd with Matthias Jacob. You can find all the information in our website, and I'll share the details on the screen.
Wonderful. He's doing excellent work on hate on the internet. So he's doing cutting edge research. So I hope you can all join us. And so Abebe, again, thank you very much. And everybody stay well and safe.
Thank you.
Okay. Be well.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.